Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm excited for this one because this week is actually my 1-year anniversary on YouTube. Yay! I mean, not entirely technically, because I did have a YouTube channel before, but I wasn't really doing anything with it, and it was just kind of me being ridiculous with my friends, like ziplining, riding a bike on a tightrope.
That's what could happen.
All that kind of stuff. But about a year ago today, I made a video where I was like, hey guys, you're all following me on here. What should I do? What kind of videos should I make? And you guys had a lot of great suggestions, and I've tried to do most of them and keep making science content on my YouTube channel when I can. And I've really enjoyed myself, so thanks for that. So for today's celebratory video, I'm going to try something a bit different and talk about another celebration of sorts. The discovery of Ernest Shackleton's ship, the Endurance. And if you don't know the story of Shackleton and his ship, I'm going to give you a quick overview as to who Shackleton was, how he lost his ship, and why its discovery is so incredible. And I know this video is more about history than science, but history is also one of my big passions, so I thought, let's take this subject for a spin once around the block. See how it feels. Ernest Shackleton was an explorer, born in Ireland in 1874. His family moved to London when he was 10, and he joined the Mercantile Marine Service when he was 16. He spent many years at sea learning his trade, and at 24 he became a certified master mariner, which qualified him to command a British ship anywhere in the world. He traveled to the Antarctic for the first time in 1901 on the ship Discovery as part of the British National Antarctic Expedition, and would do so again 7 years later on a ship called the Nimrod. These trips were all about exploration, and Shackleton was known to be a popular leader. He always kept his crew happy and focused, and he had the ability to keep everyone's spirits up in very difficult conditions. And during the Nimrod expedition, Shackleton and 3 other explorers actually made it to 112 miles from the South Pole, the farthest south latitude point that anyone had ever reached. In 1910, he actually made a couple of recordings on an Edison phonograph from his time on that expedition. And here's a little bit from one of those recordings.
And slowly we arose up the largest and the longest glacier in the world, some days spending 12 hours doing 3 miles, other times spending nearly half the day hauling each sledge up by means of the alpine rope.
But eventually that missed goal of reaching the South Pole bothered Shackleton enough that he set out for another expedition. This time in 1914, as members of the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, Shackleton and 27 men and 70 sled dogs set off on their ship Endurance, bound for Antarctica. And there were also a couple other interesting crew members on this ship. Frank Hurley, a photographer who supplied extraordinary film and photographs that documented nearly every part of this harrowing journey. And to have such a person as part of your crew in 1914, that's pretty impressive. And a man named Pierce Blackborough, who was a stowaway. I don't know what is happening in your life when you are stowing away on ships bound for Antarctica, but what do I know? He was, of course, discovered on the Endurance, but there was no turning back, so an annoyed Shackleton made him a crew member. Oh, Pierce. Pierce. It's gonna get crazy. The 144-foot, 3-masted Endurance headed through the Weddell Sea, navigating through the icy waters until January 19th, 1915, when she became stuck in that same ice. By February, it was clear that the Endurance was moving along with the giant ice floe that it was stuck into, and there was nothing that the crew could do about it. It was now actually moving slightly northward, so Shackleton told his men that there was nothing they could do about it, so let's just hunker down for the winter and wait to be thawed out. But though the men were disappointed, Shackleton kept their hopes up high by telling them that the expedition could still be completed once the ice had thawed in the spring. And at this point, there were about 60 or so dogs left, so they actually made these dogs these little igloo kennels on the ice floe that they were trapped on. They often took the dogs on journeys around the ice, continuing to train them for their use as sled dogs once the expedition resumed. But many months passed, and the ice never did melt. And on July 14th, there was a noise underneath the Endurance aft, and the carpenter on the Endurance immediately knew what that noise was. It was the wood of the ship cracking because the ice was starting to squeeze the ship. Shackleton knew that if they lost the ability to live on the ship in Antarctica, they would be in very serious trouble. And eventually, the ship did start to list to one side. Beams were buckling, the rudder was damaged, but Shackleton kept holding out hope that the ice would thaw and they could continue their expedition. And in October, the ship actually did break free from the ice for a couple of days. But eventually the ice pack returned and it became clear that the Endurance would never be able to continue its expedition. On October 27, 1915, Shackleton gave the order to abandon Endurance. The men were told to gather no more than 2 pounds of personal gear each from the ship. And on November 21, 1915, Endurance sank into the Weddell Sea, never to be seen again, until March 5th, 2022. Ernest Shackleton wrote in his journal of that November day, "At 5 p.m., she went down by the head. The stern, the cause of all the trouble, was the last to go under water. I cannot write about it." After the sinking of the Endurance, Shackleton and his crew began to live on the ice floe, and obviously at this point, all hope of this expedition is lost. Now it is just about survival. A little more than 5 months later, on April 9th, 1916, the Endurance expedition crew took the lifeboats to the uninhabited and remote Elephant Island, where they landed on April 14th, 1916. 10 days later, Shackleton set off to find help. He selected 5 crew members to join him and set sail in the 22.5-foot-long lifeboat called the James Caird. He left the remainder of his men in the care of his second-in-command, Frank Wild, who upturned the 2 remaining lifeboats to use as a very clever shelter. Shackleton and his small crew sailed over 800 miles across the Southern Ocean to a group of whaling stations in South Georgia. Ranulph Fiennes, a seasoned explorer himself who wrote a great biography about Shackleton regarding this part of Shackleton's journey, he said, "It was the most amazing suffering over a long period. There were constant rebuffs, and to be wet and cold is utterly debilitating. How none of them went completely mad over that period of floating is just incredible. I have never experienced hot or cold suffering that reminded me in an even minuscule way of Shackleton's Caird voyage." But the James Caird somehow survived the voyage, which Fiennes credits to Shackleton's leadership. He said they had already experienced Endurance sinking and lived on ice floes for months before trying to work out the safest way out. Whatever way Shackleton chose, death was the likely outcome, but he kept cheerful. After 17 days at sea, the James Caird landed on the southern coast of South Georgia, on the opposite side of the island from their destination. And after recovering from the voyage, Shackleton and 2 of his crew trekked for another 36 hours all the way back across the island until they reached one of the whaling stations on May 20th. Shackleton then arranged a rescue ship to collect the remaining 22 crew that he had left on Elephant Island. And when he arrived back on Elephant Island on August 30th, 1916, all of the men were alive. Every single one of them had survived this ordeal that at this point had lasted a year and a half. So for over 100 years, the Endurance has sat at the bottom of the ocean, completely undiscovered, until an expedition mounted by the Falklands Maritime Heritage Trust, using a South African icebreaker and equipped with 2 remotely controlled submersibles, set out to find it. And that is no mean feat, because the Weddell Sea, where the Endurance sank, is pretty much permanently covered in thick sea ice. The same sea ice that ruptured the hull of the Endurance. Getting near the presumed sinking location is hard enough, never mind being able to conduct a search. For over 2 weeks, the submersibles had combed through a predefined search area, investigating various targets, when finally, on a Saturday, the wreck was discovered. And that Saturday was actually the 100th anniversary of Shackleton's funeral. And for me, the most incredible part about this discovery is that the ship looks much the same as when it was last photographed by Frank Hurley in 1915. The masts are down, the rigging is in a tangle, but the hull is largely intact. There was damage evident at the bow, presumably where the descending ship hit the seabed. The anchors are present. The submersibles even spied some boots and crockery. They said you could even see into the porthole where Shackleton's berth was. And part of the reason why the ship was in such incredible condition was that perhaps, not surprisingly, there are no wood-eating organisms 10,000 feet underwater in the Antarctic. So the ship had just been sitting down there, fully intact, freezing, for over 100 years. And if you're interested in seeing more of Frank Hurley's footage from his time on the Endurance and everything that followed afterwards, it was actually put together in a documentary called South, and some people consider it the first documentary that was ever produced. It came out in 1919, and there are clips of it available on YouTube, so I will put a link to that in the description below if you're interested. So it's just an incredible story all the way around, an incredible story of survival and leadership, and then 100 years later, an incredible story of discovery. And I think for me, the craziest part is, you know, when you read something that's historical, and I think you can't help but think, you know, if Shackleton's ship was still out there, fully intact, somebody would have found it by now. But they didn't until 2 months ago. Crazy.
And thus we went along, and thus we returned, having done a work that has resulted in great advantage to science, and for the first time returning without the loss of a single human life. I, Ernest Shackleton, have today, March the 30th, dictated this record.
Okay, that's it for now, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please feel free to wish me a happy YouTube-versary in the comments below, if you like, or let me know anything else about the story that you thought was interesting. It's some pretty epic stuff. Just don't ask me to tell you what happened to the dogs. Hey, let's look at that underwater footage one more time.